Forging a nation from the ashes of war is complicated. New political systems, debts, traumatic memories, loss. The fledgling United States had to deal with all of these, and it did so while still debating what the future of their nation would look like. But in a world where nobody knew what the US government should look like, how did Washington set the nation up for 250 years of effective governance? Tonight, Peter Kastor makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut as we talk about how the American government was made to work. We discuss what it took to form a government, why nobody could agree on how big it should be, and how the US avoided a debt crisis that could have crippled the country before it had even got off the ground. This is Washington's government. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are already throwing the script out of the window. I am very sorry, folks. Stop shaking your head, Mr. Redden. This is your fault for bringing in a fantastic guest into the room, and frankly, having me sitting alongside you. It's. I'm going to put the blame entirely and squarely at your door on this
This is
one.
some generational gaslighting occurring, folks. This is the earliest rabbit hole we've ever had. It's rabbit hole before we even started recording, and we've now derailed the interview. Classic Zach. Do not listen to him. It's not my fault.
Well, I am the emperor of this podcast. I've even got a hoodie to proclaim it so. And so my decree shall be law in the land of the podcast. My poor guest, what he must make of this, I do not know. So for context, he turned up for this interview half an hour ago and just spent half an hour having a really interesting conversation about a whole range of things. None of them related to what we planned to cover today, which was Washington as president. We will get to Washington as president, I promise, probably. But in the interim, we've been talking about a really eye-opening project. So we are joined by Peter Kastor today, who teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author or editor, as means require, of 8 books on the American Revolution, and he has just finished a project entitled Creating a Federal Government 1789 to 1829, which is a massive digital history project. And we all know I do love a database. The impetus behind this project is effectively sort of trying to reconstruct the careers of over 30,000 federal employees from the early decades of the US federal government. So whatever the interview was meant to be about today, that bit's on pause because we are going down this rabbit. Stop rolling your eyes, Josh. We are going down this rabbit hole, whether you like it or not. Peter, hello. Thank you, first of all, for putting up with us for the last half hour as we've sort of asked all kinds of questions about this project. And apologies that you turned up to do an interview on Washington, and now I'm not going to ask you about Washington. Hi, how are you doing?
Hello,
Do
I'm
you want
doing
to run for the
fine.
hills just yet?
No, no, no. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, and greetings from St. Louis, Missouri.
So, creating a federal government, this project, we're going to do a separate interview entirely on
Hmm.
this. In fact, we did consider just doing the next 40 minutes completely off the cuff, which I'll be honest, I haven't entirely thrown that idea out the window, but I'm getting evil eyes from Mr. Redden saying,
It
for
would be the
heaven's
most
sakes.
Napoleonic Wars podcast thing ever. But we'll see. To be fair, in all fairness, joking aside, it does deserve its own interview, so I can't wait to see that one. But sorry, Zach.
Yes, quite rightly so. Quite rightly so. The power might be going to my head slightly. This project, firstly, it looks stunning. Congratulations on that, because it's very hard to get things looking fresh in a way that will sort of continue to remain kind of fresh and current beyond sort of 6 months in time when, everybody's expectations of the internet changes. So it looks fantastic. Um, give us a sense, I suppose, of what you were seeking to achieve with this
Right.
project, first of all.
I was trying to answer a question that had befuddled me, which is that Americans spent a lot of time arguing about what kind of government they should have now. And they tend to invoke the founding fathers. They say the founders wanted a big government, the founders wanted a small government. Well, I studied the era of the founding fathers, and it was clear to me that nobody knew how many people were actually in the federal government. And I'd spent a lot of time studying federal agencies, but I didn't know the answer to this question. And so I said, well, I'll find the answer to it. And I a background in digital history. So I thought this would be both a fun digital project and also an important historical one. So I partly just wanted to tell this story, to essentially do a social history of the US government. Who served in it? What did they do? Where were they located? How long did they serve? And to tell that story and to do it right, and not only to have a database that reconstructed the careers of these people, but also to have a lot of text in there that would explain to a general audience what the federal government is, what its role was, how it changed over time, and what these familiar names, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, what they did, why they did it, and how they did it.
So many rabbit holes immediately opening up. Knowing smile there from Josh. It's a an evergreen line from me on this show. Firstly, I always find it quite amusing when anybody tries to claim that a group of people wanted this, whatever this might be. So, this idea
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
the people of the UK want something. Really, who made you the person who can kind of speak for the entirety of the UK population? Same kind of issue fundamentally to say the founding fathers wanted a large federal government or a small one because they weren't universal. That's part of the point of this series to kind of look at different presidents and different
Right.
aspects of government and look at how the current US sort of system, at least in its embryonic form, gets molded by these competing pressures. Um, but before we can get to any of that, I suppose there's a question, particularly with an eye on our UK audience, where federal government isn't fundamentally a thing in the same way. What is, at the risk of sounding like my former A-level politics teacher, former self, what is a federal government, Peter?
Now, that's a great question, and it's something that it's a term people use often without thinking much about what it means. What it meant at the moment of its creation was a government that would have a balance of roles between the states and the central government. So you have distributed powers for both of these. And then within the central government, that you would have distributed roles and responsibilities for this is the part people usually know the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. At the most basic level, that's what the Constitution was creating through the notion of the federal government. The one thing I would add is that in all of the considerations that went into writing the Constitution, they were talking about those political institutions, but they also saw a role for the American people. They're part of this story as well. But their focus really was on the balance of those states and federal, and then within the, excuse me, state governments and central government, and within the central government, executive, legislative, and judiciary.
What you're talking about there in terms of employment of people within this governmental system is, as folks will realize when they visit
Hmm.
the website for this, and folks, we will put a link in the description so that you can do that. Um, at the core of this is effectively a map that visualizes this process of employing people and how this changes over time, but also who these people were. And I would urge folks to go and have a look at it. It's a beautiful creation, I have to say. I've been having a very basic play around with it. One of the things that initially really struck me was lighthouses get flagged. Why
Right.
lighthouses?
That's a great question. So I was trying to map out where federal employees were located, and lighthouse keepers were federal employees. And what's also an interesting part of this is they're part of the Treasury Department. So nowadays we think of lighthouses as part of maritime safety. They're often part of a Coast Guard. But at that time, the notion of lighthouses was that they were part of the nation's international commerce. And that commerce was taxed, and it was actually the primary source of federal revenue. So lighthouses were actually a crucial part of federal revenue at a moment when the federal government was supposed to really save the US economy. The other interesting thing about lighthouses is who served in them. So lighthouses were some of the first places where some of the first female federal employees were located. There are a small number of women who were lighthouse keepers. They were paid for this. And when they were appointed, George Washington appointed some of the first of them. He saw this in many ways as a form of pension. Many of them were widows of officers who had died during the Revolutionary War. And so what we all grow up seeing lighthouses and they can be beautiful objects, but they're also very telling ones. And when you look at where they're located, one of the things you see is that, for example, the Maine coastline of Maine, which is uh, a state now with a relatively small population relative to the rest of the US, there are these lighthouses dotting the coastline because it could be very easy to run aground there. And so the federal government is present in people's lives in all of these interesting and different ways right from the start.
We should say it's not just lighthouses. One of the things that we were discussing for about 15 solid minutes was um, postmasters
Right.
being key to this. And also, I'm keen for you to kind of expand on this kind of way in which women end up becoming employed by federal government. Just give us a little bit
Right.
more of a snippet on that.
So I want to begin by saying there were very few women who were employed in the federal government. I don't want to overclaim that, but I was struck that they were there at all. And postmasters, first of all, constitute almost half of the people in this. I should say that the project as a whole includes all of the federal agencies, some that people would automatically know about, our State Department, the Treasury Department. For the War and Navy departments, it does not include enlisted personnel in the Army or the Navy simply because we don't have good uh, data on that. But it does have commissioned officers and civilian personnel who worked for those. But there are almost 15,000 postmasters working in, I think, about 12,000 post offices. And one thing that historians have found for the US is that the post office is part of what demonstrates to Americans the federal government actually exists. So if you lived in, for example, the UK in 1800 and you sent a letter, if you lived in London, it would be delivered quickly and you'd receive your mail several times a day. If you lived in the provinces, far less likely. And if you lived in the British Empire, you would receive your mail rarely and it would be costly because mail delivery was a source of revenue for many European countries. In the United States, it was actually a tremendous cost. It was not seen as something that was supposed to generate revenue because federal leaders knew that making the postal system work was essential. It would demonstrate to someone in Georgia that they were in the same country as somebody in Maine. It would demonstrate to somebody in Missouri, where I live, that they were connected to somebody in New York. And it also reflected the political system. So I mapped out post offices in Missouri, and I was amazed by how many there were and how quickly they proliferated. One of the reasons this could happen is that when Missouri became a state, we had one representative and two senators, and our two senators were exactly the same as the senators from Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, the most populous states in the Union. And so when those senators or representatives, when they wanted a bill, the members of Congress from Missouri would say, yeah, I'll sign on to that because my vote is the same as yours, but only if you'll give me the budget for more postmasters in my state because people in Missouri need their mail. And so, for many Americans, the post office was the expression of the federal government that they encountered most often. It showed the federal government was working. Federalism is premised on the notion that all states are equal. They have different representation in Congress, but they're all equal and they're all part of a whole. And the post office really symbolized that in a lot of ways.
Are you finished, Emperor Zach?
I am never finished. How dare you question my rule?
I go
Um,
down rabbit holes all the time.
it's the mark of a good historian. I do love this project and everything you've just said. I find it
Thank you.
fascinating. Zach mentioned it there, but 30,000 federal employees, aside from being a monumental achievement to research and digitize, it's a remarkable number in itself. And I guess it reflects the other side of state building. And state building is what we're talking about here, but
Hmm.
kind of on the institutional and bureaucratic level. So wherever you stand on the question of big or small government, there has to be unelected officials. And I guess this project kind of testifies to that. So I'm glad we started the episode off in that spirit. Having said that, we do have a script to talk about. So I want to re-begin, I guess, asking about Washington himself for a moment, because put, putting aside his legacy as a general, I mean, Washington's already an American hero in 1789, and he's already a founding father. But when he comes to be president, he still has then 8 years, I guess, to kind of add to his legacy or to kind of further his status as a founding father. So, speaking specifically about the Washington presidency, what kind of president was he? I mean, how can we think about him as historians?
Right. So there's a lot to say about George Washington's presidency, but I want to begin with the big point, which is that Washington came into an office that did not exist. He inhabited it during a moment of big decisions and profound crises on the global scale. He had to make a lot of decisions, and he could easily have made the wrong decisions. What is striking about him is that more often than not, he made the right decision. And I say that knowing that, historians change over time, but what's really remarkable is that historians consistently have concluded that Washington handled the job very effectively. And this is despite huge changes in the way historians think about the past. I want to emphasize a few key elements of this. So Washington is the person who decided that the president, this was a former general, he said, the president is fundamentally a civilian authority. The president should serve a finite amount of time and then leave office voluntarily. The president should respect the role of Congress and not interfere with it. The president should have unchallenged authority over deploying federal resources. All of these were really weren't settled when he came into office. And all of these are things that he determined. And what's really important to bear in mind is there wasn't really a model that he could work from. He developed this in consultation with those around him. There were a few examples he could look at, but most of those examples said what not to do rather than what one should do. And most often, his instincts about how to create an effective presidency that would reinforce a representative government and rooted in electoral democracy, his instincts on that were really, really sharp.
So, in Peter, in the previous episode, we kind of left off by setting the stage for kind of some of the themes that are going to emerge
Right.
in this series. And one of them is kind of the question of federal authority, state versus central government. So, I mean, Washington, the man, when he comes in, where does he stand on this issue, and how is he going to negotiate kind of between those two factions?
Right. So Washington came into office knowing that this was kind of one of the great unknowns. The consensus of the people who came to New York, which is where the first US Capitol was from 1789 to 1790, had all come out of the previous nearly half decade, concluding that the Articles of Confederation, which had been ratified earlier in the 1780s, just hadn't worked. And so the Constitution required a different relationship between states and the central government. And the way Washington was going to negotiate that was primarily through the conversation with Congress, and with governors. There were certain areas in which Washington felt very strongly that not only federal supremacy, but executive authority, authority in the executive branch, was crucial. So that began with revenue. When he came into office, most revenue collection, almost all revenue collection, was at the state level, and there were a series of state authorities who would collect these, primarily import duties on foreign goods. And he quickly concluded those personnel needed to become federal personnel. And they knew it because they started writing to him saying, please let me keep my job. I'm happy to serve you. He quickly concluded that. He believed that the United States, that the federal, central government, and especially the executive, needed to have clear authority over matters in the North American West. That meant both supervising federal territories, the civil governance of white settlers in those territories, and also the management of Native American affairs, both negotiation with Native Americans and also military conflict. Washington came into office. When he came into office, the U.S. was at war with a confederacy of Native Americans in what's now Ohio. And Washington said that is the central government's authority. And he would determine both that military strategy and that diplomatic strategy. But throughout this, Washington was always seeking feedback from state officials, from their representatives in Congress, from governors themselves. And I think it's in his first year in office, he actually did a tour. He went on tour. He took a road trip. And first, he went to the northern states, states he was not from, as a way to introduce himself, to introduce the federal government, to introduce the notion of the president. And when he went to those states, he met with local officials, he met with governors. And one of the things he did very well was to begin building relationships between states and the central government. And this was at a time when a lot of the debate over the Constitution rested on assurances that this was not going to lead to some dictatorial power grab by the central government away from the states. So it was a kind of delicate dance he was involved with. One story I just want to throw into this, it's partly about the states, but it's also about the federal government. The Constitution states that federal employees are nominated by the president and their names should receive the advice and consent of the Senate before they go into effect. Washington took that seriously. He didn't just send the names of his cabinet level officers. He decided that he would also send every second lieutenant in the Army. In 1794, when the U.S. started its Navy, every midshipman in the Navy, every revenue collector, he sent their names for advice and consent. He knew that would build the legitimacy of his office and of their offices. But he one time went to the Senate and he literally walked into the Senate chamber and he said, I've come to participate in this. I want to talk with you. The Constitution says I need advice and consent. I want your advice. Members of the Senate said, this feels a lot like you've come to demand our consent. And the senators were upset. He was upset. He left, never to return. Said, I'm not going to set foot in the Senate chamber or in the House chamber. I didn't like the reception I received. And clearly, they didn't like me showing up there. And that moment speaks to uh, how uncertain all of these relationships really were.
I was very struck there by what you were saying about sort of going on tour. It almost sounds like a sort of royal procession of of almost sort of a slightly earlier era. Sort of, it reminds me of sort of what the kings of medieval England
Right.
might do, for example, in terms of going to these places, firstly to be seen, but also to make contact with the locals and sort of hear local grievances. And um, I'm just very surprised by that sort of almost royalistic approach
Right.
to government. Do we have any indication of the motivation behind that?
Yeah. So there, I can answer that question in two ways. One is your specific question about his motivation, but the other is directly related to your point about how it's like the ways that it's like and unlike what would go on in the royal courts of Western Europe. Again, in Washington's case, he wanted a better idea of what was going on in the country. This at a time when, although, as I've discussed, the Postal Service of the US was kind of a marvel of the Atlantic world, he wanted to have conversations. But he also wanted people to see and learn about the federal government, and he wanted to understand his country better. Here are some differences, though, from royal visits. When Washington became president, one of the first questions was, how should he be addressed? And John Adams, who himself was of very modest means, came up with these very elaborate titles. I can't remember them exactly, but they were some version of like, you should be called your most extreme awesomeness. It was, it was this highfalutin language. And he imagined that Washington would wear either a military uniform or the elaborate quasi-military uniforms of European royalty.
It
And
sounds
George
like
Watt,
another host we have on this podcast, Luke Reynolds.
was he talking about this?
No, I mean he would like to present himself as his
I
quote
see. That's
awesomeness,
very
but
funny. Well,
but
Washington wouldn't
continue.
have approved. He said, no, 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 just call me Mr. President. That's a huge step. And he wore a simple black suit. And I cannot overstate how important that was, and in some ways, how out of keeping that was with Washington's upbringing. George Washington was a wealthy slaveholder. He was the lord of his plantation. So not only did he own other human beings, really at risk to their own safety, had to kind of bow and scrape to him. That was the world in which he had grown up. And he was very wealthy by Virginia standards at that time, but he also was the product of the gentry culture of 18th century Virginia. That was a society really founded on deference. But with that said, one of the ways in which it's very different from the royal and aristocratic systems of Europe is, first of all, Washington himself. So, one of the things to bear in mind about the early presidents is that John Adams was the only early president with sons. Washington himself had no children. His wife, Martha Washington, had two children, including a son from a first marriage, both of whom had died by the time Washington became president. So there was no notion that he was going to hand over office to a son, nor would that be the case with Washington or with Jefferson or Madison. Madison had a stepson, but he was not turning anything over to him because he just didn't really trust or respect him. The other interesting thing is that, I emphasize Washington as a slaveholder. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all of whom were planters. People have often asked, how could these slaveholders talk about freedom and talk about equality? There's a very particular way in which the slave society enables them to do that. Because let's say in the UK, a baron or a viscount would be a landed aristocrat with white peasants surrounding him were clearly his inferiors. That's what that system did. Well, to people like, and Jefferson wrote about this a lot, Thomas Jefferson saw his white neighbors as his neighbors. They were, uh, they were farmers and blacksmiths and coopers. And he could live in this fantasy world where he believed, look, we're all equal citizens of the United States. I may be wealthier than you, but we're all Americans. He could think that way because the people who worked at Monticello, his plantation, were just sort of out of his calculus. The enslaved residents there didn't figure into this. And there was a brilliant historian named Edmund Morgan who really connected that, who said, we really need to see it's not just coincidental that people like George Washington wrote about freedom all the time and could see themselves as average Americans. It's because by dismissing the enslaved and saying they're just not really part of the story, they could see themselves as no different, in Washington's case, from the average citizens he met when he took his national tour in 1790, I think is when he took it.
And you've emphasized here, sorry, Josh, I know I hogged the mic for 20 minutes earlier, but you can now refer to me as your most extreme awesomeness. That is an entirely legitimate
Nice title, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll take it. Why not? We can stick it on a hoodie. We stick everything on hoodies on this show. So my most extreme awesomeness has another question, another rabbit hole
Yes,
to
yes,
progress down. Apologies, Josh. Um, because you were talking a lot here about sort of how Washington looks at things like conflict and the army. You know, they need to be employed by federal government. Looking at all of these sort of different institutions and thinking, well, we need that to be under governmental control. Should that therefore lead us to assume that he's in favor of big government, or is that too simplistic a stance? And equally, how much pushback does he receive on his stance, wherever that may be, on how big the government should be? Just kind of thinking back to what we were saying at the start about your project and what that revealed.
right. So the way I often describe this period, and I like saying this because everyone wants to lay claim to it now, which is that the federal government under the founding fathers, their view of it is that they wanted a federal government that was, I would argue, larger, more robust, and more capable than many American conservatives might now believe, but certainly wanted to maintain one that was smaller than many American liberals would now wish. What I would say is when Washington came into office, he started appointing people and he never stopped. He built new institutions. He felt very strongly that this was necessary. His successors did the same. The federal government didn't continue to grow and did not reach a kind of steady state on employment until about 1816. Thomas Jefferson came into office in 1801 and the following year set about trying to fire a bunch of people and say, I'm going to cut the size of the federal government. And then the following year, he starts increasing it again. Uh, they themselves argued about this. Within Washington's cabinet, which is this cabinet of luminaries, they argued about this. And at times, Congress pushed back. In 1792, and again in 1802, Congress wrote to the executive and said, we want a list of all your employees. We've been authorizing budgets to pay for them. We want to know what you're doing. And when they wrote to Washington about this in 92, what's striking to me is, he don't want it. This is a difficult job. He turns it over to his agency heads. And let me just suggest to you who these agency heads were. He gives it to his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. He gives it to his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He gives it to his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, a name people don't often know now, but one of the most capable generals of the American Revolution. And to all three of them have large numbers of employees. He also gives it to the Postmaster General and says, give me an enumeration of who all these people were. And this came because Congress was worried that if there were too many federal employees, it would either create a crushing federal budget or that it could become an agent of tyranny. That was the lesson they drew from not so much the Revolutionary War, but the years immediately before it, that appointed officials with unchecked authority would become agents of tyranny. And their vision of the Constitution was that the federal system, the federal government, would create political buffers that would prevent the government, that would enable the government to be effective and prevent it from becoming a dictatorship.
Peter, I can see from your research and the kind of things that you've spoken about so far in this interview that you're very interested and you stress the importance of kind of individuals in government, in governance. And after all, governing doesn't happen without people.
Right.
It's quite a lot of people, as you would point out, in this case at least. So on that note, thinking for a moment about kind of the top of Washington's government at the executive level, you've listed some names there, but who does Washington populate his cabinet with? And I guess the more important question is kind of what's the logic underlying those decisions? What kind of cabinet does he go for in this kind of semi-pre-partisan era in American politics?
So George Washington, among other things, invented cabinet government in the US as we understand it. And that was not a foregone conclusion. Everyone in the government knew there would be agency heads, but whether they would work together or not was uncertain. There's a great historian named Lindsay Chervinsky, who appropriately enough now runs the library at Mount Vernon, which is Washington's plantation, which itself is a terrific site of public history. They do wonderful work there. And one thing she revealed is that when Washington came into office, he selected his agency heads and pretty much thought, you'll run your agencies. As I said, it was Thomas Jefferson at State, Alexander Hamilton at Treasury, Henry Knox in the War Department. There was no Navy Department. He had several postmasters general. He also had an attorney general named Edmund Randolph, who he trusted. Randolph himself was a brilliant lawyer, but there was no agency. The attorney general was really a legal advisor to the president. And when Washington had questions, he would either meet with them individually or write letters to them as a group because he worried that to get them all in a room would seem to people like this was a connivance towards dictatorship. He was that worried about maintaining a Republican government, and that's the term people would have used at that time. Democracy was, kind of a dirty word in certain circles, but most Americans believed that they had a republic, and that's the system that they wanted. And historians have spent decades arguing about what that means. It's in the foreign policy crises unleashed by the French Revolution that Washington gets this spark of an idea. He wonders, what should the status of the US be relative to the war in Europe and to the revolutionary regime in France? And he said, I want to get my cabinet in a room. I want them to argue this issue. I will preside, but I will not dictate, and let them hash this out. And we know about those because Thomas Jefferson kept these meticulous notes of it. In Hamilton the musical, they tell that story through music, and actually they do it pretty well. But you would think from the musical that the cabinet was meeting regularly, as cabinets do now. But at that time, it was a real innovation in the US. And oddly enough, the fact that Hamilton and Jefferson really disagreed on a lot of this proved beneficial because it meant that Washington heard all the arguments. Jefferson and Hamilton would argue it out. Edmund Randolph, the attorney general, would usually seek a third way or a way that brought it together. And then at the end of the day, Washington would decide what they were going to do.
So what you're saying, don't let me put words in your mouth here, obviously, but it sounds as though that's kind of a vote of confidence for Hamilton the musical from a historical kind of getting the, I don't want to quite say kind of a historical accuracy perspective, because obviously firstly, that's not the point
Right.
of Hamilton the musical. But is that kind of a nod? Is there a sort of sense there that if you, oh, and I have to confess, I haven't seen
This is,
Hamilton the musical.
oh, you're missing out.
Okay,
You are missing out.
right. So I have been told. So that's my homework from this episode. But is there a kind of sense that you come away from that with a decent kind of appreciation of something that's going on
Right.
here?
So I'm supposed to be a fuddy-duddy academic historian and just dismiss Hamilton. But I actually think, first of all, it's a great musical. And also, and I say this as someone who doesn't really enjoy musicals all that much usually, but there are certain specific dimensions of this time that it gets really well. There are two songs about cabinet debates. One is about the assumption of federal debt. I mean, come on, how often do you hear that in hip hop? One is about American neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars, and it gets the particulars of those quite well. It would have you believe that it was done at these cabinet meetings. They weren't always done there, but still it gets the issues at work. The other thing it does really, really well is to capture the culture of honor that existed during the early American Republic. It explains why Hamilton would fight not just one, but several duels, why his son died in a duel. And the other thing it does really well is to capture why Washington emerged from this, it sort of went into this period and emerged from it, both idolized by Americans and idealized by them. I work at a university called Washington University. And that's because, as even in the 1850s, long after his death, Americans said that if you want to send a signal about what America is and what America should be, you put George Washington in it.
I love that so much, Peter. I'm impressed that it's taken us an episode and a half to talk about Hamilton in this series, but we got there eventually. And I'm
Right.
more outraged by the revelation that Zach hasn't watched it. He
Oh,
clearly hasn't.
you should definitely watch it. Look, there are things it doesn't get right, but that's typical, I would say, of any biographical movie or musical, which is it needs its subject to be the hero. I mean, it deals with Hamilton's flaws. A big part of it is this affair he has in the 1790s while he's Treasury Secretary. It deals with that really well, but there are a lot of other elements of his life that make him seem far less heroic and patriotic that that musical wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
In my defense, the last time I went to see anything remotely sort of professing to be historically accurate, it was, and you know where we're going with this one, folks, that wretched creation by Ridley Scott on Napoleon. And
Mm.
we don't need to start off on that one because we were there for that one and it was not good. Um, I want to shut myself up for a change rather than go off on an impassioned rant about historical illiteracy. Um, and instead kind of think about something that we touched upon at the end of the last episode, the first fundamentally the
Hmm.
first installment of this series, looking at Confederation America and the 1789 Constitution and the sense that there was a revamp needed, that things just weren't working out in the way that they should. Um, Now you get this sort of this change. It's barely even in place before people then start amending it. Now, in some respects, actually, I'm massively on board with the idea of amendments because flexibility in a system is how legal systems should work. But again, we're kind of drifting towards my own research biases here. Um, so the first 10 amendments of this become the Bill of Rights, but there is going to be a lot of politics at play behind those adjustments and the individuals who are driving them and that desire for amendment and then sort of pushback and perhaps even counter amendment to eliminate that in the same way that you can sort of see a ping ponging of political systems to this day, whether it's executive orders sort of wiping away certain things that the previous administration have done, or in the UK, this idea that actually can we go and sort of remove a particular bill or pass an amendment to a bill in order to um, sort of push back on certain facets of a piece of legislation that we don't like. There is always that seesawing, and that must have been there probably on steroids, I would imagine, during the birth of this country. So talk us through that kind of complex environment.
Yeah, so let me start with the Bill of Rights. I'm really glad you asked about that. I'm actually struck by how quickly those amendments got ratified. It's really striking. And you had asked who's kind of steering the ship during this. I would say it's James Madison, who was not only the principal author of the U.S. Constitution, but then represented Virginia in the House of Representatives. So he can kind of take that in with him. There are people who, in the debates over the Constitution, said that the principle and significant deficiency of it was that it had no guarantees for individual rights. One way to think about the original text of the Constitution and its amended text in the Bill of Rights is that the original text is about structures of government, it's about institutions, how what they do and how people get into those offices. The Bill of Rights is about citizens primarily, what their rights and implicitly what their expectations are. So that's in the Bill of Rights. And there were anti-federalists, people opposed to the Constitution, who said, yeah, we need to reform the government, but they were deeply concerned that this would be a government of excess power. So one of the reasons that the Bill of Rights went through pretty quickly is that its advocates could say, this is what you asked for, it's resolving the deficiencies you described, and let's just get this done. So that moves through quickly. A lot of early legislation and really, really important legislation goes through very quickly in the first federal Congress. The The Revenue Act of 1789, which established the system of import duties. I mean, this is a tax bill after a revolution fought against taxes. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the federal courts system. The Constitution established the Supreme Court, but nothing else. So all of these were extraordinary and complex forms of legislation. When Congress really started fighting, and when George Washington himself suddenly felt befuddled and kind of out of his depth, was really later in the 1790s. And the thing that divided Congress more than anything else, and in many ways drove the creation of the first party system, was the Jay Treaty of 1794, which was actually a product of the Napoleonic Wars. It's the one that's trying to establish where the US was going to be in that conflict. And it was a treaty with Britain negotiated by John Jay, who himself had been the predecessor to the Secretary of State under the Articles of Confederation, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He had left the court at Washington's request to negotiate this treaty that seemed so important. But when it arrived, it was so explosive that it not only generated new fissures in the political leadership of the US, but revealed other really deep disagreements. And the Constitution was ratified on the assumption that there would be no political parties, that the Constitution provided a way for different points of view to be expressed and would, in fact, make it unnecessary to have political parties at a time when lots of Americans thought political parties were a corrupting influence. But then by 1795, 96, the US had two political parties and hasn't stopped ever since.
Well, I think in the description of the previous episode, I wrote something like America had 99 problems in 1789. That might be a bit of an understatement. And obviously we're going to attempt to kind of go through some of those in these couple of episodes. But perhaps chief among them was, well, you can let me know if you agree with this, was the American economy and its large debt and the financial situation of the US. And that's something that no constitution is going to solve in a hurry necessarily. So, can you walk us through the nature of the debate surrounding this national debt they've accumulated from the war, and kind of what different figures were saying and what could be done about it?
Right. So this is an interesting example of complex economic forces that can actually be explained in relatively simple terms. So during the Revolutionary War, the individual states and the central government had extraordinary expenses. The primary way they tried to pay for those was by issuing bonds with the promise that they would pay back those bonds, usually with interest. The problem was that states did not have any means to generate sufficient revenue to pay off those debts. And of course, the central government, under the Articles of Confederation, was dependent upon the states for their money. So there was no way to pay back these debts. Plus, there were expensive expenses that states and the government under the Articles needed to pay. After the Revolutionary War was over, the US did not disband its army. It had a standing army, and that was expensive. So one of the great breakthroughs, one of the extraordinary breakthroughs, and indeed the single most important thing that Alexander Hamilton did was to develop a really revolutionary system of public finance from 1789 to 1791, by 91, it's in place. And here is the way it was going to work, which was, first of all, that the federal government would assume the state debts. That was a huge political undertaking, involved a lot of compromise. There's a song in Hamilton about it. Listen to that. It explains it. The southern states, which had paid off more of their debts, agreed to this plan in part because it was the right thing to do, but also with a guarantee that the permanent federal capital would move to the middle of the country and into land that is now Washington, D.C., that's from Virginia and Maryland. So that the federal government would assume state debts. Well, that's fine, but how does the federal government pay for these? And again, this is right after a war that had broken out over taxation. So the solution was an almost invisible tax. The way Hamilton's fiscal plan was, again, the assumption of state debts, that the United States would create a system of import duties so that when foreign goods entered the United States, they would have taxes assessed upon them to varying rates depending on what they were. Wool was taxed at a different rate from whiskey, for example. And the cost of that tax would then be built in to the price that the merchants charged when they sold it. And this very quickly became a steady stream of revenue. They also hoped that they would generate a lot of revenue from the sale of Western lands. Crucially, in 1787, one of the last things that happened under the Confederation government was to let the central government take responsibility for a lot of land that states claimed in what's now the Midwest of the U.S., Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, also in the Upper South and Tennessee, those areas. Those were very expensive. But also the hope was that the sale of land, public lands in the West would generate revenue. It didn't generate much, but that was part of the plan. So as the federal government started securing this revenue, in an example of how different agencies work together, the state and Treasury Department really had to work together to secure loans for the federal government. And some of these loans came from foreign banks. That's why State Department's involved. A lot of these were Dutch banks that would issue loans that would help cover costs in the meantime. Hamilton oversaw the creation of a national bank that would issue a new set of bonds. It would say, we're going to issue these new bonds that will help cover our existing debts. They will extinguish the existing debt. We now have a system to generate revenue that will not only enable us to pay off these bonds, but to pay for our ongoing expenses. And in 1788 and 89, state bonds left over from the revolution were selling below par, selling for less than their face value, because everyone assumed, yeah, I might get some payback from this, but probably not. So I'm not going to buy it for what it's worth. By the late 1790s, it may even have been earlier, these new federal bonds, they're selling above par because they're a good investment. I mean, it's a really revolutionary change. There are ways in which I really want to emphasize this. The moment of 1789 and 90 makes this possible. As I said, the US is at war. It's at war with the Native Confederacy in the West, but there is not a major Atlantic war. So there is open trade. The US is an active and aggressive um, trading nation. It's engaged with all of the nations of Western Europe. And so that vigorous trade helps to build this new tax base for the United States. Once the war erupts in Europe, as a result of the French Revolution, that really threatened to endanger this. But one of the interesting things that emerges from this is that to people in France, especially to wealthy Frenchmen, they've got nowhere to invest their money. Uh, there's this revolutionary government that they think is going to seize their property. So they're deeply concerned. And you actually see people in not only metropolitan France, but also in the French Empire, they start investing in US bonds because they're stable, they seem removed from the war, it looks like a safe investment. And that is such a profound change from just 5 years earlier. A historian named Francois Furstenberg, who is American, but who works in um, the history of, he's worked on Francophone America. He's really looked into this issue of how Frenchmen invested in the US, not just because they wanted to invest in the American political experiment, but because it was a good investment. The Constitution made it a stable government that would pay its debts. And I really can't overstate what that meant for putting the US on a sound, stable financial footing. A lot of the ways that people debate that now in the US, it seems that every year or so, there's a political fight in the US about whether they're going to raise our debt ceiling. And there are people who say we shouldn't do that because it's getting too high, we'll never pay it off. Other people say if we don't, we'll default on our debts, and we've never done that. And they chart it back to the founding fathers when establishing a reliable system of revenue was the foundation of fiscal solvency and then fiscal prosperity.
How much effort needs to go into carrying the public with this change in taxation system, particularly bearing in mind what you're saying, that this war has been fought fundamentally about taxation? Yes, we can sort of add in, taxation without representation, which clearly is not meant to be the case, at least once the US is finding its own path. But nonetheless, taxation is turning around to people and saying, "I'm going to tax you more," is never a popular policy choice. So, is there a need to kind of chivvy people along and go, come on, we all need to do our patriotic duty here. This is necessary in the interest of the survival of this nation, because you don't want to go back to good old King George and those pesky Brits all over again. Or is there kind of a fatigue, perhaps, because it's been a long road to this, or is there something else at play entirely?
Yeah. So the way you put it, which is this appeal to have people do their part, well, good luck with that in the 1790s. That doesn't go very far. One thing that political leaders could say is if there's any taxation, it's not without representation. You are represented in Congress. And I want to emphasize how Congress was imagined in the Constitution. So members of the House of Representatives, then as now, were selected popularly. Not everyone could register to vote. Voting in most states was limited to white men with a certain amount of property, although more Americans could vote than just about any other nation on earth. They had a very relatively low suffrage requirement. But there's the popular election of members of the House. Members of the Senate were chosen by states, usually by state legislatures. And it was partly on the notion that it's supposed to represent the kind of better class of society. But really, it was the House represents the people, the Senate represents the states. They're still part of the story. And the president kind of brings it all together. So there was representation for taxation. But even with that, uh, it's actually striking how quickly the Revenue Act gets approved. There's relatively little opposition to it. It did build on a foundation. There already were import duties that states had imposed, and it was what we would call an indirect tax. The only people who paid it were the merchants who were bringing goods into the US, and they just passed the costs along to other people. And if you want an example of really how important that distinction was, let's look at the direct taxes. In 1794, Congress passed a direct tax, and it was going to be a whiskey excise. And the idea was that uh, citizens would pay a tax on whiskey. And it wasn't just that they resented it, there was a full-scale rebellion. It erupts in Western Pennsylvania, and George Washington put his uniform back on. He took personal command of troops, and he thought he was going to have to lead an army into Western Pennsylvania to put down this revolt. Alexander Hamilton wrote really angry letters saying, "This is a rebel. They don't know what they're doing. Don't they know their place?" And by the time Washington got there, the issue, this rebel army had kind of dispersed. I think they enjoyed their whiskey too much. But so the whiskey rebellion subsides quickly, but it was a quick lesson that direct taxation was not going to work. The US dabbled in direct taxation. They tried it again in 1798 when it looked like the US was going to go to war with France and would have to pay for a large army. One thing I did in my project was to map out these tax collection districts, which every state had to create, and states didn't want to do this. The only time the US had a sustained direct tax was during the War of 1812, which was a fiscal catastrophe for the United States. And there were several years of direct taxation, but it took a crisis on that magnitude to do this, to make this happen. What I should say, though, is that Americans did pay taxes, but not to the federal government. They paid state taxes, and they were state property taxes. And every state had a system for assessing property taxes. And this would be, they're chilling records to look at because they partly would say, here's the taxation on the amount of land you own, on the personal property that you own, the house, the pots and pans, the uh, the animals you own, the farm implements you own, the people you own. So enslaved Americans were taxed and were a tax levied on their masters. And it's a reminder of how this world operated and the way in which, I've been talking about ways that enslavement is really a fundamental part of how the political leadership understood the world around them, how American law operated, and how American economics operated. So it isn't just that there's a slave system that has this profound impact on the enslaved, but it's part of the economy in so many ways. It's producing much of the most valuable exports from the US, which are also part of its economic turnaround.
And we will certainly get to covering slavery in greater
I'm sure you
depth
will. Yeah,
in the next episode, I think. It's really remarkable the scale of the task of governing the US in those early
oh,
years with all those problems to deal with. And while
it's
presiding over
staggering.
definitely, and while presiding over a population that had just fought a particularly bloody war just to improve their lives and solve those problems. And the
I'm
Whiskey
exhausted
Rebellion
just
episode.
hearing about it. Do you know what I mean? It's sort
I
of
know.
never mind researching it or trying to wrap your head around it, just kind of listening to this sort of deluge of problems after problems. And it brings back what you were saying at the start, that Washington somehow had a knack of making the right decisions in the right way at the right time, which I suppose sets us up quite neatly for
Yeah.
a follow-up episode. Surprise, surprise.
There we go. One thing I should add is another decision he made was that the federal government needed to preserve for posterity the records of what it did. So from the start, the US preserved the principally correspondence, the letters from these various federal agencies. And these founding fathers saved the letters they received from each other. Thomas Jefferson had a little device that could make copies of the letters he sent. And so one thing I often say is that this conversation we're having enables people to understand this. But one thing that is truly remarkable is that the letters of the founding fathers are freely available to the public on a site called that the National Archives maintains. Um, it called Founders Online. It has something like 280,000 letters that the founding fathers wrote and received. And if you want to understand how they struggled to respond to these challenges that surround them, how they dealt with their public lives as governing officials and their private lives as slaveholders and businessmen and as members of families, we now all have access to that through extraordinarily accurate transcriptions of what they wrote.
Peter, you've been brilliant, but we have taken up, well, the best part of 2 hours of your time now between on-air and off-air discussion. And we'll be bringing you back to talk even more about Washington's presidency, but also on another occasion, hopefully to talk about your digital history project, because it deserves more discussion than the small slot at the start of the episode we gave it. So thank you for coming on with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was, a lot of fun, and I'm always delighted to talk about these topics from early America.
Fantastic. Peter Kastor teaches history at Washington University in St. Louis. And please do open up the description and check out his Creating a Federal Government project. Have a play around, see what you can find. It's cutting edge history. Folks, thank you so much for making it this far. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and we will see you again very soon.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Again, The link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/napwarspod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.